the process of reprocessing medical equipment. That's seriously bad for the environment. The primary focus is patient safety. There's no room for environmental concerns. I completely agree that we cannot, as a medical device company, do anything that will compromise patient safety. We're not allowed to from a regulatory point of view, but we would also never want to, because it is human lives that we're talking about. They are more important. You don't want to risk them. But why not do both?
Welcome to the Sustainable Healthcare Podcast, a podcast where we talk about sustainability in pharma, medtech, and healthcare services with tips and tricks on how you can get there. And I'm really excited for today's episode. I am having what I would deem an absolute rock star in the studio, Thea Falkenberg from AMBU. And besides working seriously with sustainability, Thea also has a PhD in, I think it's astrophysics, and has helped put a robot on Mars. How cool is that? But today we're just going to talk about her efforts in medical devices and how to make them sustainable. Really enjoyed the episode. If you want to listen to more episodes, please subscribe to the podcast, or you can find our newsletter on greeninnovationgroup.com. Welcome to the Sustainable Healthcare Podcast here.
Thank you.
It is so good to have you. The times we've been talking, I think it's always been really interesting and straight to the point dialogues. So I've been really looking forward to this.
Me too.
But would you like to introduce yourself first?
Sure. My name is Thea Falkenberg. I'm a director of front-end and technology in AMBU, with responsibility for our patient monitoring and anesthesia devices.
AMBU is a medtech company.
AMBU is a medtech company. We make medical devices for hospitals with particular focus on single-use devices. It's an old Danish family-owned company that has grown a lot especially the past sort of 4 to 5 years. I joined AMBU 4 years ago. Before that, I worked with Haldor Topsøe on developing catalysts. And then I've been a management consultant with Boston Consulting Group, but from training, I'm an engineer specialized in applied physics. And I did my PhD in space science for NASA.
What a journey! And we joked about this before, but I have to ask, the PhD you did with NASA, what was that about? And
well, I did my master's.
To a 5-year-old, you probably have to tone it down.
I did my master thesis building magnetometers I did before my master thesis, I built the calibration targets for the Phoenix Mars landers. So I built a thingy that's on Mars today.
You build the calibration targets, which I hardly know what is, but for the robot that landed on Mars.
Yeah, the Phoenix landed on Mars in 2007. I also worked as a downlink engineer on the mission in the US, making sure we received all the data we asked for and that sort of thing.
So you were over in Florida? Or,
This was actually the headquarters for Phoenix was in Tucson, Arizona. Yeah. But it was a JPL-driven mission, so the Jet Propulsion Lab from California. And then I continued with my PhD, and it was focused on building magnetometers for the ExoMars lander, which was a European space mission that during my PhD got cancelled, and before it got cancelled, I sort of switched my focus to being more on heliospheric modeling of what happens with the magnetic fields in the solar system when something happens on the sun. So when there's a big explosion on the sun, how can we see it throughout the solar system, and how does it affect us?
Wow. There's already like 7 other podcasts that we should do that just out of my curiosity. But this is the Sustainable Healthcare Podcast. what drove you from? And I guess this is really big credit to AMBU that you went from.
AMBU wasn't what lured me out of space science.
Yeah.
No, I left space science because, I wanted to be an engineer for NASA since I was like 12 years old. And at the age of 26, I was finishing my PhD, and I was an engineer with NASA. Yeah. I spend a lot of time thinking about what it is that I really think is fun. And I love solving problems. Yeah. And back then my theory was that pretty much any problem is fun. As long as it's challenging, then it's fun. But I also realized that in sort of the academic world, I didn't always have the patience for it. Yeah. I like things to move fast, which also meant that I liked doing many things at once. I'm a good physicist, but I'm not the best physicist. And I'm also good at other things, and maybe that was sort of my primary strength, was being good at many, many things at once. Yeah. And maybe the biggest difference I could make in the world was helping to drive technology and science forward, and sort of help remove the economic roadblocks, the political roadblocks, whatever is in the way of science sort of progressing and leading to actual changes in how we do things. Wow. So I thought, okay, well, if that's what I want to do and that's what I think I'm capable of, then in reality maybe it is management I need to go into. Yeah. But I also had a very sort of solid geek diploma on my desk.
I don't think you can score higher on and that's meant as an absolute compliment.
So I spent a lot of time thinking about how do I get there, and I ended up being advised by my cousin to go into management consulting. And so I did, and I landed a job with Boston Consulting Group, BCG, here in Copenhagen. And thought, okay, well, this should be fun. I like all problems. And then I quickly realized in my time in BCG that, yeah, I like all problems, but I'm not proud of it necessarily. I'm only proud of it when it's technology driven. If it helps us do things a little bit smarter, a little bit cheaper, a little bit whatever, just a little bit better than we thought we were able to, then I'm proud of it. Yeah. I'm not driven by money. I'm not proud of making anyone more money. I'm not proud of selling more products in a consumer-driven world. That's fine. It can be fun, but Sudokus are also fun. I'm not proud of solving them.
The meaning, and hence the pride. So maybe that's a good segue over to what drove you to work in AMBU then? And how does that work you do fulfill that?
Yeah, so you can say I then sort of sought back to something that was technology driven, and I ended up in Topsø, and they make catalysts for the chemical and oil industry, which is sort of a completely different ballgame, and did business development there. And from there, I got this job opportunity in AMBU to build up this department from scratch, focusing on the old products. And you can say most people in medtech are driven by the purpose of medtech. And you can say my primary driver is a little bit different, because my primary driver is technology and furthering technology. It's not necessarily medtech, but I'm also
When you say the purpose of medtech, is that equivalent to the purpose of patient treatment, or
yes.
the purpose? Okay, yeah.
So that's very much sort of what drives most of the industry and the engineers that work for AMBU in general. I'm very driven by helping people in general, which medtech then fits in perfectly with. But I'm probably different in the sense that I could be helping people in any field and I would be happy. But it's so clear in medtech. And then it has this fantastic effect that older people in the industry are nice.
I've found that too. It's incredible. And I think it goes back to being purpose-driven, and there might be variations over that purpose. And obviously, me and Green Racing Group is coming at it from a sustainability angle, but there are so few assholes in this industry, and it just keeps surprising me. and maybe it shouldn't, but because I mean it's still large professional companies, but throughout the organizations that in general it's very good people, and I think that comes back to the fact that there's a lot of smart people in the healthcare industry, and they could have chosen differently, but they chose something with a purpose. And
they also chose an industry that is so heavily regulated that to some extent it feels like doing product development with your hands tied on your back, which you have to be passionate about the purpose to be willing to go through that. But yes, I've recruited more than 25 people over the past 4 years, and that's what I generally say in all my job interviews. There may be idiots here, but there are no assholes. So, you can disagree with people, but everybody that I know in medtech has their heart in the right place.
That's really nice. And if you had to explain to a 5-year-old what it is you do and the department you're in AMBU does, what would that look like? Or to your 6-year-old, yeah.
Yep, I try to every once in a while to explain it to him. Well, we make devices for hospitals to help medical professionals, doctors and nurses treat patients in the best way possible and in the safest way possible.
And how does your department help with that? Is that in developing the new devices?
Yes, so we develop the new devices, but we also have the technical responsibility of the devices overall, which means that there's also a certain amount of, sometimes the development is not driven by a technical development, but maybe a change in regulations that we then have to live up to something different, and that may be a documentation question, or it can be a design question that but if the requirements changed in the market, we may need to do changes in our products for them to work the best way possible for the users of the products. But you can say a lot of people think of sort of our customers being the patients, but they're not. The patients are quite often sedated when our products are around. So it's the nurses and the doctors, it's the healthcare professionals. But we also make ECG electrodes, and most people will at some point in their life have seen our electrodes. I know that before I worked in AMBU, and I didn't know what it was, but when I got to AMBU, I recognized the blue sensor electrodes as the ones that were put on me when I was giving birth, etc. So yeah,
that does sound like a lot of fun problem solving. So you are developing new products and revising old, which is, I think, a super interesting inflection point in terms of sustainability, because of course, I assume it's that you're working closely with the clinical testing of the products and eventually production and commercial and so on, but nonetheless, you're sort of forming the future of these products, which also means that you probably have, even in this very regulated industry and with all the negotiations with the other departments, you can actually make different decisions that will have a sustainability impact that will be folded out over decades then if it passes through clinical trials and so on.
And so you can say AMBU is a very, as most companies today are, matrix organizations, but AMBU is a very sort of strong project-driven organization, so it's very much in the individual projects that decisions are made, which can make it a little bit difficult to change sort of things across portfolios. But so we try to run these technology tracks, sort of doing some of the research that goes across everything that we do. So that's also how we met each other, is by us running this technology track on sustainability and sort of how can we work that into everything that we do.
And is that the ambition for you or for AMBU?
It's definitely the ambition for me. And
why
for
is that
AMBU.
important to you? Even I mean, it's of course it's always within a context of safety and efficiency and helping patients when we are in the healthcare industry. So Why is this still important for you?
I think it comes natural to a world of people who are purpose-driven.
Yeah.
When they're purpose-driven and they're intent on sort of improving the lives of others, improving the world, improving sort of everything around us, then sustainability is it's just a natural thing to care about for all of us. The trouble is trying to work it into medical devices where the regulation is already so difficult. And so when I joined AMBU 4 years ago, my first question was, I said, okay, so these are the devices I'm responsible for. A lot of them are big plastic devices and they're single use. And I came from the chemical and petrochemical industry where sort of reach and sustainability and that was sort of becoming a really big thing on sort of the horizon for us. So it was natural for me to say, but it's okay. So I imagine that my first challenge is finding out what materials do we use in the future? How do we make this sustainable? Topsy was doing pilot projects on converting sugar feedstock to ethylene, to polyethylene components, etc. And that was a natural step for me. And the first thing I was told was, no, this is medical devices.
Yeah, it's not for us.
The primary focus is patient safety. There's no room for environmental concerns. And I remember both thinking and saying, because I tend to say what I think, but that's just until somebody's able to do both. The moment somebody's able to do both, then that's the norm, then that's the industry standard. So
that's such a good point.
Why not work on it? I completely agree that we cannot, as a medical device company, do anything that will compromise patient safety. We're not allowed to from a regulatory point of view, but we would also never want to, because it is human lives that we're talking about. They are more important. You don't want to risk them. But why not do both?
Yeah.
There's no reason to believe that one excludes the other. But it does become, sort of the complexity increases quite a lot when you try to do both, right?
Definitely. We like to describe the development of sustainable healthcare as an S-curve with a very slow adoption for a long time, and then will probably be a quite fast adoption once it really takes on. And we're seeing the first indicators of that first few tenders are being lost because of sustainability, and it's slowly being worked in the procurement departments. But it's so I also probably a lot has happened in 4 years. Is that
actually less than I thought it would? It's gone slower than I would have predicted it to go. Not so much from a
that makes sense with the S-curve as well, actually.
Not so much from an industry point of view. They're moving pretty much at the pace I would expect them to, but from a customer point of view, I would have actually expected it to have their demands to rise faster. But I think COVID has also been a big part of that. The focus on the environmental agenda would have been a lot stronger if they didn't have to drop everything they had in their hands and focus on COVID. And so we also see that today in the markets, that there are two sort of a little bit opposite pulling directions, and one is pulling in a contamination minimization direction, and the other is pulling in the recyclability environmental direction. And there are huge geographical differences. So for AMBU, yes, we're a Danish company, but Denmark is not our primary consumer market. We're a worldwide company, and so we have to look at the entire world. And it's clear that the Scandinavian countries are very far ahead of the rest of the world. Our primary sort of single market is the US, and there the contamination factor is has much more focus than the environmental focus.
And of course, that's as I understand it, a very one of the key value propositions from AMBU is super sterile, non-cross patient contamination, and a large part of what drives that is the single-use approach. So,
but
I
you can
see
say
the
there's also an
conundrum,
environmental aspect to it, which is a little bit more difficult to explain, and therefore it's often overlooked. But the process of reprocessing medical equipment, that's seriously bad for the environment. You use it when you want to re-sterilize products between patients, then you're having to use either or both a lot of energy and a lot of chemicals. And the chemicals are naturally very toxic. That's the purpose of it. They have to kill off every single germ that might be hiding in a nook somewhere, and you have to dispose of those chemicals afterwards. And you don't have to do that with our products. So there is actually an environmental angle to it, but it's an environmental angle that a lot of customers are not actually ready to discuss, because that complicates the agenda to them. It was much easier when it's just, okay, we'll do everything reusable. But then you have to take into consideration what energy and what resources and what chemicals, whatever you're using to do the reprocessing.
Definitely, and that's also where sustainability becomes complex, and where climate meets environment, and you have, which I still personally in Rosen Green Innovation Group mean is the key mission is to lower the CO2 emission. That's one thing, but then you have all the environmental hazardous waste, and this. I think we should do an episode one day about the API productions in India and how that is going on, because that's ridiculous, and biodiversity and all these other agendas. And I also think it's for a lot of organizations, it becomes a bit of a paradox of choice. Well, I just started looking at this CO2 thing, and now I also have to look at material use and biodiversity and what is it, and so maybe a good way to. So when you're looking at, let's say, a new product that you would like to take to market, what are some of the, and you said that you've developed a process, at least on a project by project basis, to take sustainability into account somewhat in that development. What does that look like? What are the considerations, and where do you and your team start?
Well, so there's a lot of different considerations and a lot of different points to sort of go through. Sort of the very simplest is, to make sure that you don't use more material than you need to use. Yeah. That's one thing. Making sure that it's all made in one material that's recyclable. Yeah. Great. Yeah. That's always a huge sort of compromise exercise between functionality and wanting to make it all in one material. Materials are good at different things, right? Yeah.
So how does for instance, material reduction look like? What could a process look like for that? Or some of the questions you would ask, which is amazing for those familiar with the Ellen MacArthur butterfly diagram. One of my sort of pet points is that we focus too much on all the recycling and the sort of inner workings, and not enough on avoidance of just reducing the amount of material that gets into the loop. So how do you, when you look at that, like one of your bags or anesthesia products or whichever it might be?
So it's quite funny in the sense that before I joined AMBU, I would have always described myself as a super structured person. And being in AMBU, now I tend to describe myself more as a chaos pilot. I simply don't believe in a one solution fits all. Yeah. I don't think you can put up a process that's going to make every single project think intelligently about these questions. I think it's a conversation that you need to have in each individual project on what are the trade-offs if I ask you to use half the material, then what will you do? Is that worth it? What can we do? How can we make, does the walls have to be that thick? Could we use a material that could make the walls thinner and still have the same strength? And in medical devices, you have this, the legislation says that you're obligated to make it as safe as you humanly can. And as safe as you humanly can is, well, it's the equivalent of building airplanes out of concrete, right? Yeah. If you make it very, very safe, it's not going to fly. Yeah. And in hospitals, if you wanted to make it sort of the best possible for the environment, you should let people die. That would be that would be the most environmentally friendly, but that's not what we would ever go for, right? No. And it's the same in projects. You need to sit down and consider all of those trade-offs.
How do you facilitate that dialogue in your team then, and build a culture where you can have that conversation?
I hire smart people and I trust them to think.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's a good answer or a naive answer, but we have to take it on a product-to-product basis because there are so many considerations. And I think that's also what's making the medical device industry as a whole sort of be a little bit latecomers into the sustainability, is because it is just a very different discussion than discussing sort of how little material you could get away with using in your coffee cup. Yeah. One thing is the engineering side of things, but then you have the clinical aspect of things, then you have the biosafety side of things, then you have the quality assurance side of things and the regulation side of things. And then you also have a market with customers and patients, etc. And per definition, most sort of consumer markets are conservative if you ask them. With the environmental agenda, of course, most people will say, yeah, we want it as environmentally friendly as possible. They're not willing to pay for it, and they're not willing to compromise on safety. So that's the final aspect that engineers don't like as much, but that's the cost aspect. We also have to be able to produce our different devices at a price that is sustainable for the customers. Because, we could make the best resuscitator in the world if we could charge $100 for it. Then we could make it in sort of super materials and everything would work. But right now, customers are used to paying a tenth of that. They would not be able to keep operating the way that they're operating today if our devices were that expensive. So it's sort of it's a balance on all parameters, and it also means that every single development project will come out scoring differently on these factors, right?
Yeah, and I think that's a super good point as well, just to start with the acceptance that not everything is going to be equal, and different projects and products we can hit different. Have you managed to make any good trade-offs where you did reduce the materials or the amount of types of materials?
Development takes a long time, especially in medical devices, because you then have to test it and age it and make sure, etc. So have we made it yet? No. Are we making it? Yes, we're trying to. And the trade-offs are just very different. And there's also some sort of, you can say there is a sort of a political demand that's coming up about products being PVC free. Which from an engineering point of view can be a little bit annoying, because PVC covers so many different materials that PVC is not necessarily bad for the environment. But that has sort of been the public agenda, that PVC is bad. So that's what we see in terms.
And for our listeners, PVC is what, if you're not a...
so I forget the chemical abbreviation, but it's a plastic. It's a plastic type simply, but it's a very broad plastic type. So there have been many classifications of PVC, and actually PVC has the advantage that it's a very widely used plastic, and therefore we're also we know a lot about it, and we know a lot about the good and the bad aspects of it, and we also know how to recycle it. So the way that sort of the the way the political agenda is evolving, it turns very much sort of as soon as you realize that there's something damaging about this particular chemical compound, then the public wants it out. But that forces manufacturers into new plastic compounds, new materials, which in reality are just materials that we know less about.
Yeah.
And it could be that they're as dangerous, but we wouldn't know it yet, because that happens after 20 years use. Then you start realizing that, this particular plastic had a hormone effect on kids, but you wouldn't see that until 20 years into the future. So there's a huge balance for engineers to choose the right materials. But so if you go into AMBU's webpage, we have made we've set some goals for ourselves. We've set a goal that we want to make sure that all the new products that we launch from 25 are PVC free, or at least as close to PVC free as they can be. We've set a goal that we want to make sure that we use only recyclable packaging, if possible, because of course there might be some components that the technology is not ready for us to replace, but right now we're on pretty good tracks with replacing all of our packaging materials. And then we have an internal ambition on doing the best that we possibly can on our products, but we can't set a bar for it yet, because we don't know exactly how far we can go. Also because it depends on the market. Because right now you can get bioplastics that are made from more sustainable materials rather than from fossil feedstocks. They're still plastics. The most sustainable thing is not to use plastic, not to use anything. Plastic in itself is actually a pretty good material, but...
that's the thing about plastic, though. It's such a good material, and it's such a complex
it's so
discussion.
Versatile. But bioplastics today they're just expensive because, there's less of it, and any market effect, supply and demand. So right now it's very expensive, which means could we go in and say, okay, we want to replace every single plastic with bio versions? Yes, we could do that, but it would make our products more expensive. Would our customers want to pay for it? Well, we don't know, and it's not a clear-cut answer.
As you could probably tell, this ended up becoming a really long and enthusiastic talk with Thea. There was so much stuff to go over, and quite frankly, I could have talked with her for hours, and looking forward to do so. So we've decided to cut the episode over. So please follow through in next week, where we'll have the second half of the episode and hear more about Thea's work with sustainability in medical devices.